In our last lecture, we looked at the types of government that emerged as a result of the American Revolution and the creation of the new republic. We started off with a look at the Articles of Confederation, which was the very first form of government in this new republic. And we talked about some of the weaknesses, such as the weakness of centralized government, the inability of that government to tax or to raise an army as well. And then we moved on and discussed the ratification of the Constitution. And what we're going to discuss in this next lecture is the rise of parties during the Federalist era, and it's broken down into this first part on Washington's presidency, and then later on there's another one on John Adams' presidency. And so we're going to look at how this Constitution created a very good framework for the national government, but there were a lot of pressing problems that demanded the fleshing out of that framework. And so the government very urgently needed revenue to start paying off this immense debt that we had incurred during the Revolution. And also it had to address these unstable conditions in the West. The key really to solving these and other problems was to establish the new republic's legitimacy. And George Washington, our first president, and his supporters had to inspire this sort of popular backing for the government's right to exercise authority, even though most Americans still feared centralized authority because of what had happened under the British. The realities of governing very soon shattered the nonpartisan ideal that had prevailed when the Constitution was ratified, as many of the signers of the Constitution did not want there to be political parties in this new republic. But the parties that do emerge in this very foundational period of the new republic are actually built upon the ideals of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And if you remember, last time we discussed how the Federalists were the people who supported the Constitution and ratifying it, and also supported strong central government. And then the Anti-Federalists wanted to amend the Constitution and add on the Bill of Rights, and they really supported a much stronger state government. And so the new political parties that we have are the Federalist Party, which included Washington and his successor John Adams, and the Federalist Party favored a strong central government like it had before. And then the opposition party are known as the Jeffersonian Republicans, and this took shape as a result of differences over financial policy as well as the American response to the French Revolution. And the Jeffersonian Republicans wanted a limited role of central government in society, and also they wanted to help the French during the French Revolution. Now, Jeffersonian Republicans are led by Thomas Jefferson, and we're going to talk much more about that political party when we talk about Jefferson. So the Federalists, who governed all the way up through 1800, showed very much a doubting world that was ruled by kings and queens that the American experiment and republican government could work. But as inheritors of a political tradition that equated parties with factions, temporary coalitions of selfish private interests, the Federalists doubted the loyalty of the Republicans. And when the Federalists under President Adams attempted to suppress the Republicans, the stage was really set for this very critical election of 1800, and Thomas Jefferson's victory in that election ends the Federalist rule and the Republic's first major internal crisis. So in this lecture, we're going to take you all the way through the rule of the Federalist Foundation. So the very first thing that we're going to look at is who exactly were the people of America that George Washington was called upon to lead. And there's no one easy answer to this because there's this huge diversity amongst people's race and gender and class, as well as their ethnicity, their religion, and also their political views. And in order to get a better idea of what the American public was like, we're going to divide up each of these areas and look at New England, the Mid-Atlantic region, the South and the back country, and also the West. The National Census of 1790 counted nearly 4 million Americans, and 1 in 4 of them lived in New England. It alone of the nation's formative regions had largely shut itself off from outsiders. New England's poor soil and long, cold winters made it a very impractical kind of place to cultivate cash crops, like the tobacco and rice of the South. And as a result, New England farmers had little need of imported white indentured servants or of black slaves. Puritan values and this harsh environment combined to make New England the most religiously and ethnically uniform region in the United States, as it was during the colonial period as well. And most of the people living there were descended from English immigrants who had arrived in the 17th century. There were small pockets of Quakers, Baptists, and Catholics that gained the legal right of worship by the 1720s, but Congregationalism was really the official state-supported religion in both Massachusetts as well as Connecticut. And Black people and Indians together barely constituted 3% of New England's population. The very few remaining natives lived on reservations of inferior land, which they usually left only to find work as servants or as day laborers. New Englanders found slavery incompatible with natural rights and the philosophy that had emerged during the Revolution, and throughout most of New England they abolished slavery in the 1780s. Slavery really had always had a marginal position in their economy, so it wasn't as though they relied upon it economically. In addition, women outnumbered men in parts of New England in 1789, and this pattern is not found in other parts of the country, is the result of the pressure of an expanding population and the practice of dividing family farms among male heirs that left young men to migrate west in search of cheap arable land once the land of New England began to run out. And so by 1789, women formed a slight majority in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. But despite their superior numbers, women in New England, as elsewhere, remained subordinate to men, and Republican ideology emphasized the need of women to be intellectually prepared to raise virtuous, public-spirited children, and remember that's called the growth of Republican motherhood. And so this leads to the allocation of funds for girls' elementary education in states like Massachusetts, and also liberalized divorce laws in New England allow women to seek legal separation from an abusive or unfaithful spouse. In many other respects, politics in New England remained rooted in a Puritan past. Age, property, and reputation determined your standing in the culture, and it valued a very clearly defined social order. The moral code that governed town life promoted curbs on individual behavior for the benefit of the community as a whole. With their notions of collective liberty, these New Englanders subscribed to a version of republicanism that favored strong government, setting themselves apart from most other Americans who embraced a more individualistic idea of liberty, and republicanism that was very much suspicious of governmental power in most other parts of the Americas. The states of the Mid-Atlantic region include New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and they were probably the most diverse in the nation. People of English descent comprised a little bit less than 40% of this population, and then other major ethnic groups included the Dutch, the Scots-Irish in New York, and Germans and Scots-Irish in New Jersey and Pennsylvania as well. And with this ethnic diversity came religious diversity. So in contrast to Puritan New England, the Middle Colonies offered freedom of worship that really attracted settlers. And in addition, their economic opportunities for newcomers was much greater than in New England. The soil was better, the climate was milder, and market outlets for agricultural products was much more abundant. And these conditions really make the Mid-Atlantic region the nation's first breadbasket. The demand for labor had also been met by importing African slaves, and despite the fact that there were slaves in the port cities and in the adjacent rural areas, slavery was never really economically vital as an institution in the Mid-Atlantic region, and so the region's major cash crop, wheat, really required seasonal labor, and that didn't warrant tying up your capital in slaves. So Pennsylvania in 1780, and then New York in 1799, and finally New Jersey in 1804, they all passed laws of gradual emancipation. And the idea of gradual emancipation means that they didn't just go in and free all of the adult slaves, but they provided that the children born of a slave mother were to be freed at ages that ranged anywhere from 18 to 28. And nevertheless, African Americans had to really confront enduring white racism in this area. The comments of one white New Yorker suggest what they were up against when he said, "We may sincerely advocate the freedom of black men and yet assert their moral and physical inferiority." So it's important to remember that in places even where slavery wasn't predominant, there was certainly a particular attitude towards African Americans. Now, the diversity of the Mid-Atlantic region created a very complex political environment, and some Mid-Atlantic groups, including mercantile and financial leaders and commercial farmers, favored a very strong central government that would foster economic development and would maintain a very traditional kind of authority. But others, especially those from the middle and the lower class, wanted to keep government weak so as to foster this sort of republican equality that could promote individual freedoms. In the South, which was the region from Maryland and Delaware all the way down to Georgia, climate and soil conditions favored the production of cash staples for world markets, and cultivating these crops required the kind of back-breaking labor that forced Southerners and these Southern planters to rely on this coerced labor of African slaves, whose numbers made the South the most populous region in the country. Just under 40% of all Southerners were slaves, and their concentration really varied widely within this region. The free black population in the South had grown rapidly during the 1780s, and thousands of slaves fled behind British lines to win their freedom, and then patriots freed others as a reward for enlisting in their forces and fighting during the American Revolution. So the revolutionary values of liberty and equality also led many slave owners to question the morality of slavery, and legislatures in the Upper South passed laws making it financially easier than before for masters to manumit their slaves, and manumission is simply freeing one's slaves. In Virginia alone, 10,000 slaves were manumitted in the 1780s. Slavery, however, remained the foundation of the Southern economy, and as a result, no Southern state embarked on a general program of emancipation, and slavery really survived during this turbulence of the Revolutionary era. The economic conditions in the South, where the raw poverty of the backcountry offset the great wealth of the low country, stamped the region's politics as well as its culture. Tidewater planters were predominantly Anglican and of English descent, and they were traditionally quite wealthy. And then the Piedmont farmers were more likely to be Scots-Irish Presbyterians and Baptists. They were more evangelical in their religion and had simpler habits and taste. And these backcountry Baptists really denounced the low country planters for their luxury as well as for their arrogance. And planters understood liberty at this point to mean the power of white males, unchecked by any outside authority, to rule over others, and in particular they meant the power of property owning and wealthy white males. The only acknowledged check on this power was the planter's sense of duty, his obligation to adhere to an idealized code of conduct befitting a gentleman and a man of honor. And these backcountry farmers jealously guarded their liberties. But as we find through the diaries and records of many of these plantation owners, they didn't always necessarily live up to these obligations to treat their family and their slaves and their servants well. Between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River stretched the most rapidly growing region of the new nation, which was the West. During the 1780s, the white population of the West exploded from less than 10,000 to 200,000. And in comparison, the Native American population in the region was just 150,000. Although natives and white settlers had struck many friendships and mutually advantageous ties, their relationships were very much marked by tension as well as by sporadic violence. For example, when James Boone, who is the eldest son of Daniel Boone, who had blazed the first trail for white settlers into Kentucky, was captured, tortured, and killed by a band of natives, a group of white settlers went out seeking vengeance for his death, and they lured some Mingo natives into their camp and got them drunk and then killed and scalped them. And according to one account, they strung up a pregnant Mingo woman and, quote, sliced open her belly with a tomahawk and impaled her unborn child on a stake. And these natives had every reason to oppose the white intrusion, and they strongly resisted any white claims on their lands. Most white migrants in Kentucky and Tennessee were the young rural poor from the seaboard slave states, and this is because the West offered them the opportunity to claim their own farms and to gain economic independence free from the dominance of planters and from the economic competition of slave labor. But planters also saw the West as a land of opportunity, and in particular they wanted to speculate in these vast tracts of Western land. Life in Western settlements was harsh and it was often cruel, and mortality was very high, especially among infants. And travelers from the East described settlers living in these very crudely built log cabins with squalid, filthy interiors that were infested with fleas and lice. And many of them were squatters, which just means that they were occupying the land in the West in the hopes that someday they would gain title to it. Easterners also found an appallingly casual acceptance of violence in the West, and men commonly settled disputes in this sort of knife-slashing, eye-gouging brawl. In Kentucky, squatters, who were aligned with this very small class of middling landowners, spearheaded the movement for political separation from Virginia that gained statehood for the territory in 1792. But despite the statehood movement, the ultimate political allegiance of the West was still uncertain in 1790, and Westerners wanted the freedom to control their own affairs and outlets for their crops. Apparently, they were willing to strike a deal with any outside power, including the British and the Spanish, offering to meet these needs. The Congress that assembled in New York from 1789 to 1791 faced a challenge scarcely less daunting than that of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It had to give form and substance to the framework of the new national government as outlined in the Constitution. Executive departments had to be established, a federal judiciary organized, sources of revenue found, terms of international trade and foreign policy worked out, and a commitment to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution had to be honored. So these staunch supporters of the new government had easily carried the first national elections in 1788, and they had a large majority in both houses of Congress. These people brought superb administrative talents to the task of governing. Many, though, were clumsy politicians, and they were unsympathetic to the egalitarian sensibilities of the electorate. So by 1792, they really faced this growing political opposition. Before we jump into our discussion of the election of George Washington, I just want to do a quick sidebar and make sure everybody understands the concept of the Electoral College, especially because it's a large part of contemporary politics and also it's very controversial. So the Electoral College is an institution that officially elects our president as well as our vice president every 4 years. And these people are not elected directly by voters, and instead they're elected by these electors. They're chosen from a popular vote on a state-by-state basis. The electors are apportioned to each state as well as to the District of Columbia, but they're not given to our territorial possessions like Puerto Rico, for example. The number of electors in each state is equal to the number of members of Congress to which that state is entitled. So today, if you look at the Electoral College, there are a total of 538 electors, and that corresponds to 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 senators, and then 3 additional electors from Washington, D.C. So the candidate that receives an absolute majority of electoral votes, which is currently 270, for the office of president or for the office of vice president, is elected to the office. The 12th Amendment provides for what happens if the Electoral College fails to elect a president or a vice president, and you'll see in the upcoming lectures why this became so important. So today, if no candidate receives a majority for president, then the House of Representatives will select the president, with each state delegation, instead of each representative, having only 1 vote. And if no candidate receives a majority for vice president, then the Senate will select the vice president, with each senator having 1 vote. Now, this has become very controversial, the idea of the Electoral College, because critics argue that the Electoral College is inherently undemocratic, that it gives swing states disproportionate influence in electing the president and the vice president. The Electoral College gives a numeric advantage in the election of the president to these smaller states, as the minimum number of electors for the smaller states is 3 compared to 1 for the election of representatives. And on the other hand, the winner-take-all method of voting really favors the larger states. On 4 occasions, and the most recent one was in 2000, the Electoral College system has resulted in the election of a candidate who did not receive the most popular votes in the election. And a number of constitutional amendments have been proposed that want to alter the Electoral College or replace it with a direct popular vote. And this is the reason why I'm often talking about the idea of a republic being created and republican democracy, because we don't have a direct democracy in America like they did in ancient Greece, for example. Now, let's go back in time to the election of George Washington. On February 4th of 1789, electors from all of the states that had ratified the Constitution met in their state capitals, and they unanimously selected George Washington to be the nation's first president. It is the only time in American history that this has happened. And John Adams, another prominent revolutionary leader, received half that number of votes and became the first vice president. Now, the nation celebrated Washington's election in this grand style. He traveled from his home at Mount Vernon in Virginia to the site of his inauguration in New York City, and many towns erected triumphal arches, such as one near Trenton, New Jersey. And although leading men in the community typically greeted Washington, giving him a military salute, in Trenton he was met by local women who had erected the arch and who serenaded him. And a placard on the arch proudly proclaimed him the defender of mothers, also who defended their daughters. The first problem for Washington and Congress was to decide just how the chief executive of the new republic should be addressed. In a debate that tied up Congress for a month, the more democratically inclined members of the House argued that a title like His Highness smacked of a longing for monarchical rule. John Adams and others grudgingly agreed to accept Mr. President. But whatever his title, Washington was intent on surrounding the presidency in a halo of respectability, and he set down guidelines for presidential etiquette. He established strict rules for his interactions with the public and met with visitors twice a week for an hour. He bowed with Republican deference to the people, but refused to shake hands. Washington traveled outside New York in a luxurious coach pulled by 6 horses, and at all times he carried himself with a stern reserve. Meanwhile, Congress got down to business. James Madison, now a representative from Virginia, early emerged as the most forceful leader in the House of Representatives. To allay the fears of anti-Federalists that the Constitution granted too much power to the national government, the Federalist had promised to consider amendments that protected both individual rights and liberties and the rights of states. But Madison, concerned not to have the new government immediately hobbled by concessions to states, astutely kept the focus of the amendments on personal liberties. Madison submitted 19 amendments, and Congress soon settled on 12. 10 of those amendments are known collectively as the Bill of Rights and were ratified by the states and became part of the Constitution as of December 15, 1791. The Bill of Rights has been one of the most enduring legacies of the first Congress. The first 8 amendments are concerned mostly with individual rights, as you can see here. They guarantee religious freedom, freedom of expression, and the safeguarding of individuals and their property against arbitrary legal proceedings. Only 3 amendments speak of state interests, citing the necessity of a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. The Second Amendment guarantees the right of people to keep and bear arms. The 9th and the 10th Amendments stipulate that the powers not granted to the national government in the Constitution are retained by the people and by the states. The Bill of Rights broadened the government's base of popular support. Once Congress submitted the amendments to the states for ratification, North Carolina in 1789 and Rhode Island in 1790 overcame their lingering objections and joined the Union. The Bill of Rights also assured Americans that the central government would not try to impose on them a uniform national culture. In the summer of 1789, Congress authorized the first executive departments: the State Department for Foreign Affairs, the Treasury for Finances, and the War Department for the nation's defense. These departments already existed under the Articles of Confederation, and the only debate about them concerned the extent of presidential control over the officials who would head them. The Constitution was silent on whether or not the president could dismiss an official without the Senate's consent. Congress decided that the president could do so, setting an important precedent that bolstered presidential power. Department heads would now be closely bound to the president. As a group, they would evolve into the cabinet, the president's chief advisory body. For his presidential cabinet, Washington assembled an impressive group of leaders who had distinguished themselves in American public life. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, was a leading general. His eventual successor, Edmund Randolph, was the new Attorney General first, and he had introduced the Virginia Plan in the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, had been the primary author of the Declaration of Independence and the first American minister to France. The first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had been one of the co-authors of the Federalist along with John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Although none of these men had been anti-Federalists, Washington's choices cut across a wide section of the political spectrum, with Hamilton representing the extreme nationalist position and Jefferson far more sympathetic to state power. In addition to creating these new departments, the government sought to figure out the exact role of the judicial branch. The Constitution called for one Supreme Court, but they left it to Congress to authorize lower federal courts, and the Judiciary Act of 1789 established a Supreme Court with one Chief Justice and also 5 associates. As I mentioned previously, the first Chief Justice was John Jay, who had helped to write the Federalist Papers. The Judiciary Act also provided for a system of 13 district courts and 3 circuit courts of appeal, and it established the office of the Attorney General. So this Judiciary Act really represented a compromise, and it balanced both the Federalist and the anti-Federalist concerns, as cases about the Constitution were first heard in the state courts, and then the highest court, the Supreme Court, was empowered to rule on the constitutionality of the decisions that were made by the state courts if it was needed. So in this way, people who were worried about the role of a strong centralized government were having their fears assuaged because they knew that the states would also have some power. The act also included a fatal provision, which becomes really important in American history. The law stated that the Supreme Court could force presidential appointments of judges, and this law is eventually overturned. When we talk about Jefferson's presidency, we're going to talk about a court case of Marbury versus Madison, and it will become really this defining part of the legacy of both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. During ratification of the Constitution, anti-Federalists had expressed fear that the Constitution would create a large, expensive government with a vast bureaucracy. In reality, the federal government was far less imposing. Scattered among buildings near New York City's Wall Street, the temporary home of the new government, the government offices bore slight resemblance to the nightmare that anti-Federalists had predicted. The scale of the new government was modest, and its bureaucracy was small, with only about 350 officers. Jefferson's State Department employed 2 clerks, 2 assistants, and a part-time translator. In comparison, the modern State Department employs 8,000 people in Washington, D.C., and 11,000 overseas. The largest department was Alexander Hamilton's Treasury. Within a year of its creation, it boasted nearly 10 times the number of employees of the Department of State. Its budget was more than triple the combined budgets of the State and War Departments. Apart from his close relationship to George Washington, his role as the Secretary of the Treasury ensured that Hamilton was a figure to be reckoned with in the new government. In addition to dealing with the formulation of the new government, George Washington was also in charge of controlling the borderlands, and for all of its symbolic importance as a source of Republican order, the back country had so far been marked by constant conflict among owners and settlers, and especially between Native Americans and Americans. So Americans fought over land prices and over the rights of ownership of this land. Seeking quick revenue, the government sold these huge tracts of land to speculators and large proprietors, some of whom were federal officials. Alexander Hamilton and the Secretary of War Henry Knox were both silent partners in the huge Maycomb purchase in New York, and proprietors subdivided their tracts for sale, but their prices were often too high for average settlers, who squatted on the lands and claimed the rights of possession and improvement. And keep in mind that most of these lands were owned by Native American tribes or were settled by Native American tribal groups. So squatters, proprietors, and government shared the assumption that the land was theirs to fight over. The Treaty of Paris did not acknowledge native claims, and treaties promising these natives peace in exchange for their land proved illusory. By the time George Washington took office in 1789, the back countries were in an uproar. Undisciplined federal troops and state militias roamed western lands in search of a fight, often attacking neutral or sympathetic villages. Betrayed and angry, natives banded together in loose confederations, retaliating against settlers and striking alliances with both the British and the Spanish. By 1789, the eastern woodland and Great Lakes nations had been deeply altered by the westward pressure of white settlement. In the north, a group of battered Iroquoian villages traded large tracts of land for promises of security and called on tribes of the Northwest Territory to do the same. However, these peoples refused and effectively shut down settlement north of the Ohio River Valley. In the south, the Creeks, trapped between white settlements and the Native American nations of the Mississippi River Valley, allied with militant Cherokees to keep the Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky frontiers ablaze with war parties. President Washington had more reasons to worry about the Western territories. By 1789, Spain was actively luring United States settlers into New Spain at the foot of the Mississippi River in order to weaken the loyalty of the West to the new United States government. In the Great Lakes region, Britain hung on to the string of forts it had promised to give up in the Treaty of Paris. Many Americans believed that Britain was biding its time to regain control of the lands south of the Great Lakes. This turmoil took its toll in the East. The inability of the national government to control Native Americans angered states, would-be settlers, and small business owners. Landowners complained that their property rights were not being protected, and small settlers complained of favoritism in land distribution. Understanding that both external relations and the domestic authority of the federal government were at stake, Washington turned immediately to the problem of the backcountry. Working with Secretary of War Henry Knox, Washington sought a more fair and consistent Indian policy. He also used the territories to demonstrate the power of the federal government. Less than a month after assuming office, Washington submitted to Congress a report by Knox on Indian affairs. Knox argued that the United States should acknowledge a residual Indian right in the soil, not affected by a treaty between Britain and the United States. That right should be extinguished, he insisted, only by separate dealings with Indians. He recommended that the United States purchase the native claims to disputed lands, and in 1789, Congress appropriated $20,000 for these negotiations. In part, Knox and Washington shifted policy in the name of justice, but they also wanted to avoid the cost of having to take the Northwest Territory by war. A change in tactics did not mean a change in ultimate goals. Although Knox tried to keep white settlers outside treaty boundaries, his policy did not recognize Native Americans' right to refuse to negotiate. In seeking to bolster the authority of the national government, he argued that these Indian bands were not communities within state borders, but rather they were foreign entities on the level of nations. Indian relations were therefore properly the business of the federal government. Knox, in effect, declared Indians aliens on their own lands, using federal policy to define these Indians as the ultimate outsiders. By 1790, continuing troubles in the Northwest Territory convinced Washington to project a military presence there. His first two efforts were dismal failures. In 1790, a combined Native American force led by the Miami war leader Little Turtle routed the United States Army led by General Josiah Harmer. The next year, a much smaller party crushed the troops of Territorial Governor General Arthur St. Clair. In 1792, Congress authorized strong coercive force, bigger, better paid, and better trained, and Washington turned to a seasoned infantry officer, Pennsylvanian Major General Anthony Wayne. By the time Wayne found the Indians in 1794 at Fallen Timbers near Lake Erie, his army was more than 3,000 strong. Facing a force of just 400 warriors, Wayne claimed a decisive victory that some historians would also call a massacre. According to the Treaty of Greenville, signed August 3, 1795, the natives ceded 2/3 of the later state of Ohio and a piece of present-day Indiana. In return, they received annual federal payments ranging from $1,000 to $500 per band. The annuities bought the United States influence within Indian communities and rendered the natives more economically dependent. The treaty also tried to impose white ideas of work and economy by offering native annuities in the form of farm equipment, cows, and pigs. Native efforts at Confederacy proved less successful in the South, where deep fractures existed within the Cherokee and Creek nations. Older leaders, wearied by constant warfare and mixed heritage populations familiar with white economic and social ways, sometimes favored accommodation and entered into agreements they lacked the authority to make. At the Treaty of New York in 1790, Alexander McGillivray and other Creek leaders agreed to exchange lands belonging to the entire Creek nation for annual payments from the federal government and promises of U.S. protection for their remaining lands. A faction of the Cherokee Nation signed a similar pact in 1791. These internal disputes weakened Indian military efforts. When the government proved unable to stop settlers flowing into the future states of Tennessee, younger Creeks, Chickamaugas, Cherokee, and Shawnee repudiated the treaties and attacked the Americans at Buchanan Station near Nashville, Tennessee, planning to move on Nashville itself. Fearing reprisals, older Cherokee leaders betrayed the plan, and the assault was thrown back. U.S. Indian commissioners used military victories to coerce new land cessions and to insinuate white customs more deeply into Indian culture, especially that of the Cherokees. Resistance continued in the North and the South, but dreams of a pan-Indian confederation were temporarily stymied. They would be resurrected at the turn of the century by two Shawnees. One would become an important prophet. The other, his half-brother, was named Tecumseh. The West posed a domestic as well as an external threat to the federal government. By 1791, Western settlers were disenchanted with the seeming inability of the government to protect their interests and had begun disregarding federal policy. They trespassed on native lands, sent unorganized militias to enforce their claims, and they even traded illegally with natives. In 1791, Western Pennsylvanians rejected federal authority explicitly, setting the stage for a direct confrontation. The trouble began with the passage of Hamilton's excise tax. This was part of his 5-point plan that we'll talk about in a moment. Living in a gateway to the Northwest Territory, residents of western Pennsylvania anticipated an economic bonanza from westward migration, but were frustrated with the failure of the government to secure safe passage into the Ohio River Valley. Hamilton's tax on spirits fueled their simmering anger over the questions of Republican fairness. Many Americans regarded excise taxes, which are internal taxes on specific goods, as unfair in principle. This particular tax seemed targeted specifically at Western farmers, who found it easier to transport their grain in liquid than in bushel form. Popular protests intensified at each new report of the Army's failure in the Northwest Territory, efforts that this tax was supposed to fund. Western Pennsylvanians vowed that they would not pay the tax, and they urged citizens to treat tax collectors with contempt. Washington took the challenge seriously, and in August of 1794 he sent 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania. Against this show of force, the Whiskey Rebellion fizzled, but the government drove its point and power home. Remaining protesters were rounded up. 20 were sent to Philadelphia to face treason charges, and 2 were sentenced to death. Washington pardoned them both, but he had proven the authority of federal law. Western Pennsylvanians were not without sympathizers, however. The congressional elections of 1792 were contests between the policies of Alexander Hamilton on the one hand and the beliefs of the self-named Republican interest on the other, over what it meant to be a Republican nation and society. In 1789, Congress requested that Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton issue a report on the new nation's economy. Between 1790 and 1791, Hamilton responded with a series of reports, each corresponding to a major part of his overall plan to bolster America's economy. These included reports on public credit, a national bank, the establishment of a mint to coin money, and manufacturers. Hamilton saw a strong national government as a necessity to promote American prosperity and to protect the young nation's economic interest against foreign threats. In his view, the Constitution had created a central government with considerable power over the economy. In his reports, he urged Congress and the President to use this authority to encourage economic growth. To accomplish this, Hamilton looked to Britain as a model. With a robust manufacturing and financial section and the powerful Bank of England to energize its economy, Britain had the most diverse and sophisticated economy in Europe. Alexander Hamilton envisioned America as a powerful nation with a strong government and a vigorous commercial economy. Before he could implement his ambitious program to realize his vision, however, Hamilton would have to overcome opponents at nearly every turn. Hamilton's bold program not only frightened former anti-Federalists, but also alarmed strong supporters of the Constitution, notably James Madison, who did not wish to see the new government become a powerful state modeled on that of Britain. Hamilton's economic vision also clashed with Thomas Jefferson's vision of a nation of small farmers. The new opposition to Federalist efforts to create a powerful centralized government who called themselves Democratic Republicans or simply Republicans, united former anti-Federalists and those Federalists who shared the concerns of Madison and Jefferson. Republicans believed that liberty could flourish only if the states remained powerful enough to protect their citizens from the new federal government. And you see here on the screen a quotation from Thomas Jefferson that shows a little bit of his view as well as that of Democratic Republicans about the economy and banking. And I chose this one because I just thought it was so appropriate given the state of the economy today. He says, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Alexander Hamilton, the leader who conceived this audacious Federalist agenda, a vision that would transform America, was a self-made man who lacked the aristocratic upbringing of his chief opponents, Virginians Jefferson and Madison. Hamilton came from a modest background. Born in the West Indies, the illegitimate son of a Scottish merchant and a planter's daughter, Hamilton was orphaned at an early age but became an apprentice clerk in a merchant firm. At age 14, he wrote, "My ambition is so prevalent that he loathed the groveling condition of a clerk or the like, to which my fortune condemns me, and would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station." Hamilton was talented, ambitious, and hard-working. The proprietor of the merchant firm recognized his talent and helped him finance his education. He attended King's College, now Columbia University, in New York City. During the American Revolution, he rose rapidly through the ranks of the Continental Army to become Washington's personal aide. Marrying into a prominent New York family, he became an important political figure in that state. A successful lawyer, he had many friends and allies within New York's merchant community. New York merchants commissioned the portrait you see here of Alexander Hamilton to honor his contribution to their prosperity. It provides one measure of his power and influence, especially within the new nation's financial world. Yet the painting is notable for what the artist omitted as much as it is for what he included. Hamilton insisted that no references to his important political accomplishments be included, something that commissioners of the portrait had requested. Realizing that his political life was controversial, Hamilton directed the artist to avoid these references. Rather than depicting the complex, often contentious quality of his life, the painting presents the image of a disinterested Republican statesman and a writer. Hamilton was an unabashed American nationalist and an elitist who viewed democracy with suspicion. He believed that there would always be class divisions. To survive and prosper, the new nation had to win the allegiance of the rich and the powerful, binding their interests to those of the new federal government. The first part of Hamilton's five-point plan was the Tariff of 1789. And this was a tariff that discouraged foreign competition, it protected domestic manufacturing, and it forced foreign companies to raise prices in American markets and raised revenue for the U.S. government. The second point of his five-point plan comes from his report on public credit. And at this point, after the American Revolution, the United States owes a huge amount of money. It owes $20 million to the states and $40 million to private individuals that have been held in bonds, as well as $11 million to foreigners. And to prove that the United States could pay back credit, Hamilton said they should exchange the old debt, including accrued interest, for new government bonds, bearing interest at about 4%, and that the government should assume responsibility for all of the war debt that the states had. They only sold these bonds to very wealthy people, so this made the average people dislike the plan. They didn't feel invested in the future of the nation. But the intent of this was to give the nation's creditors an economic stake in the stability of the new nation. The third part of the plan comes from his report on manufacturing, and he wants to show support to U.S. manufacturing at all costs through tariffs, loans, business grants, and tax deductions if necessary. The fourth part, which we've already looked at a bit, that was terribly unpopular, is the whiskey tax, which was an excise tax on the production, sale, or consumption of whiskey produced within the United States to raise additional revenue for the U.S. government and to establish government authority to tax citizens. And then the final and probably most controversial of his 5 points is the chartering of a Bank of the United States. The United States needed a financial institution to control the money that they raised through taxes, and the power to create this bank was not in the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton cited what's known as the Necessary and Proper or Implied Powers Clause, which says that Congress can make laws to assist their work in areas specifically. And in the Constitution, it says that states have the power to tax, to mint money, and to pay debts. And of course, Jefferson and Madison have a much more strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they really reject this implied powers clause. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were a study in contrasts, and it's particularly important to look at the differences between them because it will help us to understand the kinds of parties that formed in this time period. Their backgrounds varied greatly, as Thomas Jefferson was a Southern slave owner and Hamilton was a Northerner with abolitionist sympathies. Jefferson grew up a Virginia aristocrat with every advantage that life had to offer, and then Hamilton was a self-made man who confessed that he was determined to escape his humble origins at almost any cost. Over several of the most important issues facing the new American nation, these two men found themselves in separate camps, as summarized in this table. In general, Hamilton sought to endow the national government with additional powers, and Jefferson sought to limit the powers of the federal government and protect state authority. The two men also approached the economy from radically different philosophies. Hamilton's idea of a thriving commercial republic was diametrically opposed to Jefferson's vision of a nation of independent yeoman farmers. While we have land to labor, Jefferson wrote, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench. And in contrast, Hamilton believed that America needed to emulate the powerful, diversified economy of Britain and foster commerce and manufacturing. So this gulf separated the two men over constitutional law as well. Hamilton believed in a broad or loose construction of the Constitution, that the federal government had to have wide latitude to choose whatever means was best suited to accomplish its legitimate objects, and Jefferson, by contrast, believed in a strict construction of the Constitution so that the powers of the new government would be limited to those clearly established by the Constitution. And in foreign affairs, the two men also opposed one another. Hamilton was an Anglophile who believed that Britain's path to economic power ought to guide America, whereas Jefferson savored all things French, from wine to pastries, and he thought America's interests were better served by supporting France. The idea of political parties was inimical to the Republican values of the post-revolutionary era. In the struggle over ratification in 1788, James Madison had written in Federalist No. 10 that, quote, the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties. These partisan struggles that dominated American politics after the ratification of the Constitution forced James Madison to rethink his negative view of parties. And in 1792, he conceded that in every political society, parties are unavoidable. Although Americans increasingly used terms like party to describe the bitter conflicts of the 1790s, the partisan alignments they described had not yet achieved the organized structure of modern political parties as we know them. And so political conflict in the 1790s was really a transitional phase in the evolution of a modern two-party system. Some historians describe this period as that of the first-party system, but many characterize it as a proto-party system that set the stage for the later development of modern parties. And indeed, although Americans were deeply divided politically, neither Federalists nor Republicans functioned as disciplined modern political parties. Neither group organized loyal supporters around well-defined messages at a national level, nor did either side create permanent political structures that brought local and state politics under the umbrella of a coherent national organization. The partisan conflicts of the time period produced two proto-parties, as we've discussed before, the Federalists and the Republicans. The expansion of the press facilitated the rise of partisan politics. The number of newspapers increased from around 100 in 1788 to well over 200 by 1800. And while eastern ports still supported the majority of papers, a lot of interior market towns also began boasting papers by the 1790s. Many of these papers aligned themselves with one or the other main political movement in the country. So, for example, John Finno's Gazette of the United States, which was established, he said, to endure the general government to the people, articulated the Federalist point of view. And then to combat Finno's influence, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison persuaded the poet Philip Freneau to found the National Gazette, which rallied opposition to Hamilton and the Federalists. And this resulting battle of words between the two publications intensified this already charged political atmosphere that existed. The Federalists and the Republicans recognized that political success meant managing public opinion. All power, Madison noted, has been traced to public opinion. A free government, therefore, calls for a circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people. So partisan rancor in the press grew during the 1790s, and no person was sharper in his attacks than Federalist William Cobbett, who wrote under the pen name Peter Porcupine, a choice that reflected his prickly personality and his barbed writing, and you see an example of one of his cartoons here. Jefferson lamented that a single sentence got hold of by the porcupine will suffice to abuse and persecute me in their paper for months. He lambasted the Republicans as atheists and radical Democrats who sought to destroy the government. He compared the leading Republican newspaper, the Aurora, to a lewd and common strumpet, whose illegitimate offspring were falsehood and slander, and the Republicans replied with their own stinging attacks. So this Republican cartoon that you see here casts Cobbett literally represented as Peter Porcupine, doing the devil's work as he's encouraged by Great Britain represented as a lion. The emergence of a new type of political organization also helped transform the political life of the new nation, and between 1793 and 1794, 35 Democratic Republican societies sprouted up across America. And although not official organs of the Republican movement, most of the societies had close ties to local Republican organizations. Their goal was to influence public opinion. So the New York Democratic Republican Society asserted that public opinion is the foundation of all our liberties and constitutes the only solid groundwork for all our rights. In addition to publishing their sentiments about political issues, these societies staged celebrations, gave festive dinners, and sponsored public orations. And Republicans viewed the societies as a way to improve understanding of political issues and to refine public opinion, while the Federalists denounced these self-created societies for sowing the seeds of jealousy and distrust of the government. For the Federalists, the societies not only sapped the people's confidence in their government, but they also fomented radical ideas. The Federalists viewed the role of elected representatives much differently from Republicans. They supported a more traditional Republican ideal of virtue in which citizens deferred to the wisdom of their leaders once they had been placed in office. On the other hand, Republicans embraced a more democratic ideal in which the voice of the people can be brought to bear on public questions through organizations like the Democratic Republican Societies. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do before we finish up this lecture and talk about Washington's foreign policy is to just do a quick recap of the two political parties that have begun to form in the 1790s. And although we've covered it up to this point, it's such an important part of this lecture that I think it's really important to make sure you fully understand it. So first of all, it's important to know that by the time we get to the end of Washington's presidency, we've got two proto-parties that begin to form and are beginning to solidify. On the one hand, we've got the Federalists, who are supported by people like Alexander Hamilton and are sometimes called Hamiltonians. On the other hand, we've got the Democratic Republicans, who you'll sometimes see listed as Republicans and are supported by the likes of Thomas Jefferson. What's really important to remember is that when I use the term Federalist and we're in the 1790s, it does not have the same meaning as the Federalist of the late 1780s, who supported the Constitution and a strong centralized government. In this case, it's now a political party that's centered around Hamilton's financial plan and much of Washington's presidency. So if we look at the chart here, it very quickly outlines the differences between the two parties. And one of the most important of these is that Federalists are loose constructionists of the Constitution, while Jeffersonians are strict constructionists. And that simply means that when you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 is called the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Elastic Clause. And this is the clause that grants Congress a set of so-called implied powers That is, powers that are not explicitly named in the Constitution, but are assumed to exist because of their being necessary to implement the powers that are expressly given in the Constitution and that are named in Article 1. So people like the Federalist would have appreciated a very loose interpretation of this elastic clause, while the Democratic Republicans would have wanted to limit the power of government or of the federal government and give more power to the state governments. When it comes to the economy, Federalists believe that Congress can control commerce, can coin money, can pay debts, and collect taxes, and also that the government can have its own bank, the Bank of the United States. Whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans identify with individual liberties and the heritage of the American Revolution, and most importantly, they do not favor a national bank. When you look at the people who make up the ranks of the Federalists, they're usually speculators, merchants, manufacturers, and commercial farmers, often people who are quite wealthy, versus the Democratic Republicans who are committed to an agrarian, rural farming America in which power remains in the hands of the farmers and the planters, and that was really an ideal that was espoused by Thomas Jefferson. Also, the Federalists show a distrust, really, for common people. They believe that for these uneducated commoners to rule might actually bring the downfall of government, and they felt that the federal government should protect commerce rather than interfering with it. Whereas Jefferson and his followers believed that the best government was the government that governed the least, a more laissez-faire approach to governing. And then the last difference between the two is that the Federalists are going to be pro-British, whereas the Jeffersonians and the Democratic Republicans are going to be much more pro-French and pro-helping the French out during the French Revolution. Okay, so the last thing I'd like all of you to do in order to fully understand the development of the political party system, as well as the evolution of political parties, is to go to the link that you see here, and I'll also include it in your folder this week on Blackboard. And this is a link to Pearson's timeline of political parties. Simply launch the timeline and then click through the pictures in the middle section of the page to learn about the different political parties that existed in different periods of American history. It should just take a couple of moments to do, but it's really important to understand that, for example, when we're talking about the Democratic Republicans, which we're often calling Republicans, in the 1790s, there's a party switch or a shift that happens in the 19th century that means that the Democratic Party today is more closely aligned with Jeffersonian Republicans in the past than the Republican Party today would be. So you want to make sure that you understand that kind of shift in American politics. And while it doesn't necessarily become too important in this class, it is important in your understanding of our political system in general. The line separating foreign affairs and domestic matters in the new republic was often quite thin. America still needed to secure its borders against potentially hostile European powers. The British continued to occupy forts in the Old Northwest, which is the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, and engaged in trade with native people, including the sale of firearms. The Spanish presence in Florida and Louisiana gave them control of the Mississippi River, a vital artery for Western trade, and American shipping no longer enjoyed the protections of the British Navy. In the Mediterranean, pirates based in northern Africa harassed American ships and captured American sailors and cargoes. So in this particular lecture, we're going to focus on three different parts of Washington's foreign policy. We'll discuss first the relationship with France, then we'll discuss the relationship with England, and finally the relationship between the United States and Spain. And we'll pick up with the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean when we talk about John Adams' foreign policy. So, if we start out by looking at the relationship between America and France in the 1790s, there are two big issues. The first is that the French are fighting the French Revolution, and the second is that the French are also engaging in war against the British, who they've fought many times throughout history, as well as with the Spanish, especially for territory in the New World. And so, if we look at U.S. history further back during the American Revolution, the French under Marquis de Lafayette had come and actually helped the Americans, and in particular, it was their naval force that had helped the Patriots to win their independence. And during this time period, the United States had actually signed an agreement that they would help the French during the French Revolution. And initially, both the Democratic Republicans as well as the Federalists wanted to support the French in their revolution and the revolutionary government. But as the revolution became more violent and you began to see more death, for example, the execution of Marie Antoinette and King Louis, as well as the use of the guillotine, which the French called the national razor, to kill anyone who was viewed as an enemy of this new revolutionary government, many of the Hamiltonians began to question their allegiance to the French. And so Thomas Jefferson, on the one hand, supported these revolutionaries. He believed that the overthrow of bad government should be done through the spilling of the blood of tyrants in order to instate a democratic government. On the other hand, the Federalists supported the king, and in particular, they wanted to make sure that they didn't ally with France because it would have angered England. And the United States was attempting to rebuild its economy under Hamilton based on the British plan, which would have meant that we would need someone to buy our manufactured goods and we would need a strong trade alliance with England. So George Washington comes in and he creates something called the Neutrality Proclamation. And this proclamation says that the United States will be friendly with both France and Great Britain, and it's not going to pick one side or the other. Instead, the U.S. needs to focus on issues at home and to ensure the stabilization of the new government so that this Republican experiment can last. Now, as a result of this, Thomas Jefferson actually resigns as Secretary of State, and he has these objections that, one, they're ignoring the treaties that were signed with the French during the American Revolution, and two, they're refusing to repay the French debt from the American Revolution, and that such conduct is unbecoming of a gentleman and also of a statesman. One of the most infamous scandals of George Washington's career centers around this issue between the United States and France, and it's called the Citizen Genet affair. And Citizen Genet was the French foreign minister, and he became very angry when the United States refused to help France in their revolution, and also because the United States refused to help the French in their war against Spain and Great Britain. So he came to the United States and he came to the people directly without the approval of the president, and he began trying to recruit and arm American privateers to join these French expeditions against the British. He also organized American volunteers to fight Britain's Spanish allies in Florida. And Washington viewed his actions as having endangered American neutrality in this war between France and Britain. And Washington knew that if Britain believed that the United States was supplying soldiers to France, then they would no longer have a good treaty with them. And this angered Washington, who wanted to extradite Citizen Genet to France. The problem with this is that the radical Jacobin Party had just taken power in France, and they had ordered the arrest of Citizen Genet, and Washington knew that if he sent him back, that this party would kill him as a traitor to the cause of the revolution. So George Washington very generously issued a pardon, and eventually Genet actually married the daughter of Governor George Clinton of New York, and he became a United States citizen in a sort of happy ending to this affair. Over time, the issues between Britain and America began to boil over despite this issuing of the Neutrality Proclamation. And the big problem was that Britain started to impress US soldiers, which meant that they would take American soldiers off of naval fleets and they would force them to come work on their own ships. And they would also seize American ships in this effort to prevent any trade between the US and France. And so Washington decided to send in John Jay, his Chief Justice, to negotiate an accord that was known as the Jay Treaty. The American public found the resulting agreement flawed, but for the most part it was accepted. Jay had to abandon the right of the United States to continue trading with France without British harassment, and he had to grant Britain the most favored nation status, giving up the American right to discriminate against British shipping and merchandise. He also had to reconfirm that the American commitment that pre-revolutionary debts would be paid in full to the British. And in all of his treaty, he actually doesn't really even bring up the issue of impressment or ensure that the British will stop impressing sailors. So in return for the major concessions that Americans make, the British pledge that they will compensate American merchants for their ships and their cargo that they seized between 1793 and 1794. They promised to abandon the 6 forts that they still held in the American Northwest, and also to grant the United States limited trading rights in India as well as in the British West Indies. However, when the treaty was finally signed, it caused an uproar, as Southerners saw it as a sellout to their interests, and they worried that impressment would continue as well. Our last bit of foreign policy to consider is the relationship between Spain and America. And in the 1790s, the United States wanted the right to use the Mississippi River, as well as the ports in New Orleans that were owned by the Spanish. They were also angry over the fact that the Spanish had supported native attacks against colonists in the West. And so Thomas Pinckney, the United States ambassador to Spain, was sent by Washington to sign a treaty with Spain. And this treaty is known formally as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and informally it's known as Pinckney's Treaty of 1795. Now, the Spanish were willing to sign this treaty because, first of all, they felt threatened by the improved relationships between the United States and Britain after the Jay Treaty, and then secondly, because Spain was an ally with France, and they feared this sort of British retaliation if they didn't. So the Treaty of San Lorenzo gives the United States the right to transport goods on the Mississippi River and also the right to store goods in the Spanish port of New Orleans. It yielded a large area of Florida, which had been disputed for years, and established the 31st parallel as the northern border of Florida, and this was defined first by the Treaty of Paris. In addition, Spain agreed to stop inciting native attacks against the Americans, and finally, it granted American farmers the right of transit through the port of New Orleans. Although there's nothing in the original Constitution that limits presidential terms, the nation's first president declined to run for a 3rd term, and he suggested that 2 terms of 4 years each were enough for any president. His voluntary 2-term limit became the unwritten rule for all presidents until 1940 with the election of the 4-term president FDR, who helped pull America through the Great Depression. And after the death of FDR, we see the signing of the 22nd Amendment, which actually institutes a 2-term policy for presidents. But according to Washington, his 2 terms in office were more than enough. The partisan politics that emerged in his 2nd term especially, and its expression in the partisan press, really disgusted Washington. He announced his decision to retire from public life in his farewell address of September 1796, less than 2 months before the presidential election. He intentionally delayed the announcement to minimize the time the Republicans would have to prepare for the campaign. Washington devoted most of his address to denunciation of partisanship, and he invoked the Republican ideal of disinterested, independent statesmanship as the only sure and virtuous guide for the nation. He warned against any permanent foreign alliances and cautioned that the Union itself would be endangered if parties continued to be characterized by geographical discriminations, Northern and Southern, Atlantic and Western. In this famous portrait of George Washington done at the end of his presidency in 1796, Gilbert Stuart created a painting filled with symbolism that captured the central role of Washington's presidency in launching the new nation. When the painting was first displayed publicly, the announcement noted that Washington was surrounded with allegorical emblems of his public life in the service of his country, which are highly illustrative of the great and tremendous storms which have frequently prevailed, but made clear that these storms had abated, and the appearance of the rainbow is introduced in the background as a sign of America's bright future as ushered in by the first president.